The smell of stone dust is not something you forget. It settles in the back of the throat like fine chalk, and once you have worked with it long enough, it becomes as ordinary as bread. He was sitting at a bench he had built himself, in a room that had once been a storage shed. His hands moved in the slow, deliberate way of someone who has learned the cost of hurrying. A piece of black granite rested in a padded clamp. He was making a line. One clean line. Through the single window, the afternoon had gone the color of old pewter. A truck changed gears somewhere in the middle distance. He set the tool down and looked at what he had done. He tilted the stone under the lamp. Then he picked the tool up again. Something quiet had already been decided. You could see it in the way he worked, in the particular stillness of a man who has stopped waiting for something and started, at last, simply living. Arthur Seel had built the company with his own hands, his own name, and 43 years of patience. That was not a figure of speech. He had cut the first stone himself in 1981, in a rented shed on the edge of Carvel, Ohio, with a borrowed chisel and a level his father had left him. He had lettered the first sign over the door himself, standing on a milk crate in the November cold, his breath coming out in small clouds while he worked. He had driven the first delivery himself, 4 counties over in a borrowed truck, because he could not yet afford his own and because he would not trust a piece of work that personal to anyone who had not made it. His wife Maureen used to say that Arthur built things the way some men prayed, with complete attention, with the understanding that the quality of what you made said something essential about who you were. He had never been a wealthy man. Seel Monument Works had always been modest in scale. 4 employees at its largest, 2 delivery trucks with the name painted on the doors, a clean workshop, a reputation that held up over decades in the cemeteries of 3 counties. He had never borrowed more than he could pay back. He had never promised more than he could deliver. In Carvel, Ohio, where people had long memories and talked to each other in ways that city people no longer did, that kind of steadiness was worth more than it looked from the outside. He had been doing this work for so long that it had become inseparable from him, not in the way of someone who had no other self, but in the way of someone whose work had shaped their hands and their eyes and their particular sense of time, until the work and the person were made from the same material. When he ran a finger along a finished cut, checking by touch what his eyes had already approved, it was not vanity. It was calibration. 43 years of it. He had not expected the company to last forever in its current form. He was 71. He had had a cardiac event in the spring, a frightening morning in the hospital with wires on his chest and doctors using words he had to ask them to repeat. He had recovered and been back on the floor within 6 weeks, moving at the same pace, doing the same work. But he was not a fool about his age. He had known, in the abstract, that things would change. He had not known they would change this way. By the time Brendan Wick married his daughter Lorena and began taking an interest in the business, Seel Monument Works had more orders than Arthur could fill in a quarter. Arthur had been willing to share it. That had always been his nature. When Brendan came in with ideas about digital storefronts and regional marketing campaigns and a software system for client management, Arthur had listened to all of it, approved most of it, and made room for the younger man at the table. He told himself that was wisdom. He thought Brendan was both a man with good ideas and a man who was genuinely good. He was wrong about the second part. He would come to understand that fully on a Thursday morning in October, but the seeds of it had been present for longer than he had allowed himself to clearly see. The meeting was held in the back office, the one where Arthur had run the quarterly review for 29 years. He arrived first, as he always did. He made the coffee, as he always did. He set out the 4 chairs around the table and placed a pad of paper and a pen at each place, out of a habit so ingrained he did not think about it anymore. He had been running this room for nearly 3 decades. He knew the sound the heating made in the walls and the way the morning light came through the single east-facing window and the particular quality of silence in that room when it was waiting for people to arrive. He stood at the window with his coffee and looked at the street outside while he waited. Brendan arrived with the 2 minority shareholders. Clifton Burr, who had bought in 6 years ago and rarely came to anything, arrived looking at his phone. Petra Wills, who handled the company's accounting and had been quietly aligned with Brendan for at least 2 of the past 3 years, arrived carrying a folder. Arthur had noticed that alignment without remarking on it. He had filed it in the part of his mind that kept track of things he did not yet need to act on. He noticed it now. Brendan sat down and opened his folder and spoke with the particular controlled warmth of someone who has rehearsed what he is about to say many times. He used phrases like transitional leadership and capacity considerations and the company's long-term health. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have decided that the presentation of a thing matters more than the thing itself. He mentioned Arthur's cardiac event, and he framed it gently, as a reason to be careful, as evidence that he and the board cared about Arthur's well-being. He said the word retirement, the way you might say the name of a gift you had chosen with great care for someone who had not asked for it. Clifton Burr did not look at Arthur during any of this. He looked at the pad of paper in front of him and made small marks with the pen. Petra Wills looked at her hands. Brendan looked at Arthur with the steady expression of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and has reorganized his feelings about it into something he can live with. Arthur listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. Brendan finished. The room was quiet. He had proposed a formal restructure. Arthur would retain his title, honorary and unpaid, and receive a consultant's stipend of nominal value for 12 months. He would have no operational authority. He would not be asked to come in. The company would continue under its current name, which Brendan described as a tribute to Arthur's legacy. Arthur allowed this phrase to move through the room and settle without comment. He sat with it for a moment. Not a long moment. He had been sitting with it in one form or another for longer than anyone in that room knew. He had felt this coming the way you feel a change in weather, something in the quality of small interactions, something in the way decisions had begun to be made without him. Small things first, then slightly larger things, until the shape of what was happening became clear enough to see. He said, "I appreciate you laying it out clearly." He stood up. He buttoned his jacket from the bottom button to the top, the same way he had always buttoned it. He crossed the room to his desk in the corner. He opened the bottom left drawer and took out a canvas roll, the kind a mechanic might use for wrenches, tied with a short leather lace. He tucked it under his arm. He stood for a moment and looked around the room, not with anger, not with grief, with the steadiness of a man confirming what he already knew. He looked at the shelves he had put up himself in the first year. He looked at the old clock on the wall that had been his father's. "Thank you for the years," he said. "I mean that." Then he walked out. Brendan sat very still for a moment after the door closed. Then he cleared his throat and began to talk about the next agenda item. The drive home took 11 minutes. Arthur knew every light, every corner, every place where the road dipped and filled with standing water in a heavy rain. He had driven this route for over 4 decades. He drove it now at an ordinary speed without thinking about where he was going, the way you navigate a familiar route while your mind is somewhere else entirely. He did not feel the things he expected to feel. There was something present that he could not name cleanly, a compression behind the sternum, a kind of sustained low note. But it was not rage. He had looked for rage and found something older and quieter instead, something closer to a verdict that had already been delivered in a room he was not present for, and he was simply receiving the paperwork now. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. Maureen had been gone for 6 years. Boyd lived in Columbus and called on Sundays. Lorena would hear about this from Brendan before the day was out. She would call in the evening with a careful voice, trying to hold 2 things at once, the loyalty she owed her father and the life she had built with her husband, and Arthur would make it easy for her, because making things easy for the people he loved was something he had always been capable of. He got out of the truck and walked around to the back of the property and stood in the doorway of the old storage shed. It had not been used for anything in years. It had a concrete floor, one window facing west, a workbench along the back wall, and the particular quality of a room that has been waiting for a purpose. It was roughly the size of the first shed he had ever worked in. He set the canvas roll on the dusty workbench and stood in the room for a while. He did not call Brendan. He did not call Boyd. He did not call a lawyer, not that week. He did not tell the story to anyone, because there was nothing in it he wished to hear himself say aloud. The story, as he understood it, was not about what had been taken from him. It was about what he was going to do next. When his neighbor Phil Dugan came by 3 days later and asked how things were going, Arthur said, taking a bit of a change of direction, and left it at that. Phil looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who understood more than he was being told. "Well," Phil said, "you know where I am." "I do," Arthur said. He went back inside. Connie Marsh came by the following Saturday. She ran a print shop on Millard Street called Marsh Print and Design, a small place with a hand-lettered sign that Arthur had made for her 11 years ago when she first opened. She arrived with a covered pan that she set on his kitchen counter without ceremony. She sat down at his table and asked him plainly what he was going to do next. "I'm going to work," Arthur said. Connie looked at him with the particular quality of attention of someone paying genuine interest to what is in front of them. "What kind of work?" "The kind I'm good at," he said. She nodded once. She did not say she was sorry. She drank her coffee and asked if he knew anyone who still did hand-cut lettering for decorative inserts, because she had a large order for funeral programs coming in. He said he might be able to help. She asked what he would charge. He gave her a figure. She considered it for a moment without blinking. "Fine," she said. "I'll bring them Monday." She did. The shed took 2 weeks to put right. He cleaned the concrete floor until it was as clean as it was going to get. He put weather stripping on the door and a new latch on the frame. He rigged a proper lamp above the bench, a solid adjustable one he had been keeping in the garage, and ran power through from the house for the small grinder he would occasionally need. He built 2 new shelving units along the back wall from timber he had in the garage, cutting everything to length with a handsaw, because the work felt right that way, unhurried and precise. He was not in a hurry. He had never done good work in a hurry. He brought the canvas roll inside and unrolled it on the clean bench. He had carried this roll in the door pocket of every truck he had owned for over 40 years. It was stained with oil and time and the kind of grime that lives on tools used daily in serious work. He unrolled it slowly. The tools inside lay arranged as they always were, each in its worn pocket, each in its correct position. He looked at them for a long moment before touching any of them. He had made most of these tools himself in his 20s, back when a monument cutter made his own tools, because factory-made ones did not hold an edge the way you needed them to. The trade had changed since then. Most people bought from suppliers now, and those tools were technically fine. But the tools in this roll were not adequate. They were right. The burin at the center of the roll was the one he reached for first. It had a wooden handle that he had turned himself on a small lathe, the wood gone dark and smooth with decades of use. His initials were stamped into the base of the handle, pressed into the wood with a small steel die he had made himself when he was 24 years old. A.S., just deep enough to read with a thumbnail. The steel of the blade had been reshaped and sharpened so many times over the years that it was now perhaps half its original length. But the weight of it was right. The balance was right. When he held it in his right hand, with the heel of his palm resting against the bench, everything fell into place with the ease of something done 1,000 times, which is not ease at all, but 1,000 separate rehearsals of correct practice, until the motion has become part of the body. He worked on the first piece for 3 hours. It was a small obsidian panel, a memorial piece for a family who had driven up from Dayton specifically to ask him, not the company, to do it. They had known his work from a stone he had cut for their grandfather 15 years ago. They had found him through someone who had found him through someone else, the way reputation travels in small communities, not through advertising, but through one person trusting another enough to pass a name on. They had arrived at his door with a combination of hope and uncertainty that people carry when they're trying to get something important done correctly. He had taken their commission and sent them home reassured. He finished the piece and held it at an angle under the lamp. He checked each letter. He checked the spacing. He ran one finger along the deepest part of the cut, feeling for the consistency that his eyes alone could not fully verify. It was good work. It was as good as anything he had done in the company, and in certain respects it was better because there was nothing between him and the work now. No schedule bearing down, no second job stacked behind this one. There was only the stone and the tool and the lamp and whatever amount of time it required. He set the piece down and went inside and made his dinner. He sat at the kitchen table to eat it, something he had not done in years. He had gotten into the habit of eating at the counter or in front of the television, the shortcuts of a man living alone whose meals had become formalities. Tonight he set a cloth on the table and a proper glass and ate his food slowly. He listened to the house, the furnace, a branch moving against the eave outside the kitchen window, the particular quiet of a house at dinner in a town where everything slows down after dark. He did not think about Brendan. He was finished thinking about Brendan. He thought instead about a conversation he had had with his father many years ago, before the business existed, and he was still learning the trade from an older man in the next county. His father had come to the workshop to watch him work one afternoon, and after a long silence had said, "The only difference between a craftsman and a man who makes things is whether the work costs you something. Not money. Whether you put something of yourself into it that you do not get back. Whether each piece takes a little from you and leaves the world with a little more." Arthur had been 22 or 23. He had not known what his father meant, not fully. He was beginning to understand it now, at 71, in a way that felt less like an arrival and more like a return to something he had always known, but had allowed to become buried under the practical necessities of running a business. Over the following weeks, the orders came in slowly, and then with more regularity. A funeral home asked if he did custom engraving on urns, and he said he did. A school principal called about a dedication plaque for a new library wing. He charged fairly and worked carefully and turned nothing away that was within his capacity. He was working the way he had worked at the very beginning, before the company had staff and schedules and quarterly reviews. He was working the way you work when the work is its own reason. There is a quality to that kind of work that is different from any other kind, and once you have known it, you know when it is absent, even if you cannot always name what has gone missing. It has to do with the ratio between what you are doing and why you are doing it. When those two things are perfectly aligned, when the doing and the reason are the same thing, you stop measuring time in the usual way. He had known that quality was absent for years. He had not said so, not even to himself. He was saying so now, quietly, through the fact of being back in a small shed with his tools and a single lamp and no one waiting on the other side of the work except the people who had asked him to make it. Connie Marsh kept sending him lettering work from the print shop, and at some point, without either of them making a statement about it, it became a natural arrangement. He would come into the shop on Tuesday mornings to deliver finished pieces, and they would have coffee at the small table in the back, and she would tell him what she had coming in, and he would tell her what he needed, and they would talk about other things as well. About the town, about a biography she was working through, about the way the light changed over the cornfields in November, about a piece she had seen at a funeral the previous week that had been done by someone who did not know how to space letters properly, and about which neither of them felt they needed to be diplomatic. She did not pity him. She had never pitied him. She treated him with the directness of one working person for another, which was the only form of respect that meant anything to him at this point in his life. He remembered that he had always liked Connie. He had not thought about it in those terms before, because there had never been occasion to think about it. But now, on Tuesday mornings over bad coffee in the back of her shop, he found himself looking forward to those 2 hours in a way that was simple and uncomplicated and good. One morning in early December, a cardinal landed on the windowsill above his bench. It sat there for nearly 2 minutes, perfectly still while he worked around it. He watched it without stopping his work, the way you watch something that requires nothing of you except to notice it. Then it was gone, and the windowsill was ordinary again, and the morning continued. There are mornings in a workshop when everything is aligned in a way that cannot be manufactured. The light is right, the stone is good, the tool is sharp, and the mind is clear and quiet, and the work comes out as if the hand has stopped being an instrument and become part of the process itself. He had known those mornings throughout his working life and had forgotten, somewhere in the accumulated business of running a company with staff and overhead and quarterly reviews, that they were what the work was actually for. Not the business, not the growth, the mornings. He was having those mornings again. Not as luck, as a consequence of having cleared everything out of the way and left only the thing that mattered. He thought sometimes about the young man he had been when he cut the first stone in 1981. 28 years old, working in a rented shed not much different from this one, with tools he had made himself and more determination than money. He had not known then whether the work was going to become anything. He had only known that it was the right work, the work that made sense of his hands and his patience and his particular way of paying attention. He had cut the first stone, and it had been good, and the next one had been good too, and that was how 43 years had accumulated, one correct cut at a time. He was doing that again. He was back at the beginning, which was not a defeat. It was something else entirely. It was the kind of beginning that only becomes available after a long time, when you have enough behind you to understand what you are starting toward. If this story is speaking to you, please subscribe to Old Hand's New Life. There are many more stories here that deserve to be heard. He worked through the winter at his own pace, and the work was good throughout. Spring came, and with it the kind of business that springs always brought to monument work. People buried in winter were memorialized when the ground softened. Families who had put decisions off through the cold months made phone calls. Arthur's workshop was steady with orders, more than the previous season, more than any single season he had managed on his own. He took what came at the pace he could manage without cutting corners. Seel Monument Works, 2 miles across town, was not having the same spring. Arthur heard things the way you hear things in a town the size of Carvel, not through deliberate inquiry, but through the ordinary permeable nature of being somewhere long enough that information simply finds you. He heard it in the hardware shop, where the owner mentioned the Monument Works account had gone quiet. He heard it through the florist who arranged alongside monument commissions and who said, without editorializing, that she had noticed some families choosing to go elsewhere. A family who had intended to use the company for a substantial commission arrived at Arthur's workshop somewhat apologetically, as if they expected him to find the situation complicated. He took the commission and said nothing about why they had come to him instead. The truth was that Seel Monument Works had not failed. It was still operating. The work was technically correct. Deadlines were being met. But something had shifted in the relationship between the company and its clients. Something in the texture of it, and people in small towns feel that kind of shift before they can name it. They feel it in the small exchanges, in the way a phone call goes, in whether the person on the other end of the conversation seems to be with them or managing them. There is a difference, in monument work, between a company that makes stones and a person who makes stones. The difference is invisible when the person is present. It only becomes apparent in their absence, when the stones are still technically correct. But the conversation that used to surround them, the conversation about a life, about what mattered, about the particular qualities of a person that the stone was meant to carry forward, that conversation has been replaced by a form and a price sheet and a turnaround time. Clients noticed. They noticed the way people notice when something that was once warm has become efficient. They could not always say precisely what was missing. They said things like, "It's not the same," or "We just went elsewhere this time." They said them quietly, to each other, not to Brendan. Brendan heard versions of this, filtered through second-hand reports and small declines in the order book, and he attributed them to competition and market changes and the difficulty of transitioning an established client base during a period of leadership change. These were not entirely wrong explanations. They were also not the complete one. Brendan had hired 2 technicians. They were proficient and efficient. They understood the equipment and produced work that would pass inspection, but they did not know that old Hattie Fenn preferred her husband's stone to have an oak leaf border because he had tended the oak trees on their property for 30 years, and she had mentioned this once, in passing, in a conversation about something else, and Arthur had written it down and remembered it. They did not know that the Lucero family always requested a particular style of cross that Arthur had adapted years ago specifically for them, adjusting the proportions from a design he had first seen in a Mexican cemetery on a trip he and Maureen had taken in the 90s, and which he had sketched in a notebook and kept in a file for exactly this purpose. They did not know the weight a client needed to feel in a room when they were making a decision that was permanent and irreversible and mattered to them in ways that were difficult to put into words. Arthur had carried all of that in the part of a person that cannot be filed or transferred. He had accumulated it because he had cared enough to pay that kind of attention over decades, and that kind of caring does not come with the lease on a building or the signature on a restructuring agreement. You cannot hire it, you cannot install it, you can only grow it, slowly, through the practice of treating people as if they were more than a transaction, and doing that consistently enough, across enough years, that it becomes simply the way you operate. Brendan knew this at some level. He had always known it. But knowing something and being willing to fully account for it are different operations, and Brendan, for all his competence, had always been better at the first. In June, he found the card. He was reorganizing the filing cabinet in the back office, going through the lower drawer that still held a few items from before the change. He pulled out a laminated card, roughly the size of an index card, covered in Arthur's handwriting. He held it under the desk lamp and looked at it. It was a list of clients, 43 names. Beside each name, a brief note. The notes were precise and personal, enough to remind someone when picking up a phone or opening a door what this particular family needed in order to feel that they were dealing with a person who genuinely understood them. Hattie Fenn, husband Thomas, oak border preferred. Ask about the trees. The Lucero family. Modified cross, file B12. Mother speaks some English. Do not rush. The Pemberton family. Lost a child in 2003. Be careful around younger plaques. They come back every few years. Brendan stood in the back office for a long time looking at that card. He thought about Hattie Fenn, who had called the previous month to say she was going elsewhere for her own stone after 30 years with the company. She had been very polite about it. She had said nothing unkind. He had thanked her and put down the phone and felt a flat, hollow feeling in his chest that he had not examined closely. He thought about the Lucero family, who had not returned for a commission they had discussed for months before the change. He thought about 3 other clients who had called specifically to ask if Arthur Seel was still with the company, and the way his throat tightened each time he told them no. He stood there long enough that it might have become something. He thought about calling Arthur. He could approximately hear how that conversation would go. The civility of it, the brevity of it. There was no version of that call in which Brendan arrived at the other end, with more than he currently had. He had made the decision he had made, with the minority shareholders and with legal advice and with a clear sense of the company's direction. He had been right to make it. The company needed to move. Arthur had been resistant to things that the market required. This was what he told himself, and it was not entirely untrue, which was what made it possible to keep telling himself. He put the card in his desk drawer and closed it. He went back to work. The County Veterans Memorial Project had been in discussion for 2 years. Carvel sat at the edge of a county that had sent its fair share of men and women to foreign fields and wanted to honor them properly, with granite plaques bearing every name set into a new memorial garden at the courthouse. It was the largest single monument commission the county had put to tender in a decade. The selection committee consisted of 5 members. Phil Duggan, who had been a small investor in Seel Monument Works years earlier before cashing out, was one of them. The tender went out in August. Seel Monument Works submitted a proposal. Arthur did not intend to submit one. He heard about the project through Connie, who had seen the notice in the county paper and set it on his bench one Tuesday morning, folded to the relevant page, without comment. He read the notice. He looked at the specifications. He was quiet for a while. "You could do that work better than anyone else in this county," Connie said. She was not asking him to agree. She was presenting a fact that she thought he was capable of assessing honestly, as long as he was being honest with himself. "I could," Arthur said. "So?" He was quiet again. He looked at the notice once more. He thought about the scale of it and what it would take and whether he wanted to be that visible. He thought about the names, the men and women from this county who had gone and not come back. He thought about the families who would stand in front of those plaques for the rest of their lives. He went home and spent 3 evenings writing a tender document at his kitchen table. He did not have a company behind him. He had a workshop, a set of tools, 43 years of practice, and a reputation that had been accumulating in this county long before Brendan Wick had attended his first board meeting. He submitted the tender the day before the closing date. He mentioned it to no one except Connie. He went back to work. The selection committee met in late September in a room at the county administration building, fluorescent lit and practical, with folding chairs and the particular atmosphere of official decisions being made without ceremony. Phil Duggan sat at the table with the 4 other committee members. Arthur came alone and sat with his hands folded on the table. He looked the same way he had always looked in the presence of people who were about to assess something he had made, attentive, unhurried, at ease with silence. Seel Monument Works had sent Brendan and a young technician with a professional portfolio. Brendan presented for 22 minutes. He was thorough, composed, and well prepared. He covered the company's history, its current capacity, its pricing, and timeline. He was everything he had always been in a presentation. He was good at this. Arthur presented for 11 minutes. He set 3 sample panels on the table without narrating them and let the committee pick them up. He waited. He had learned over 4 decades that the most important thing you can do when your work is being assessed is to stop talking and let it speak for itself. The committee looked at the panels. A woman Arthur did not know turned one of them slowly under the overhead light, studying the depth of each cut, the angle of the serifs, the spacing between letters that only reveals itself to someone who has spent enough time looking at lettering to feel, without measuring, when something is exactly right or not quite right. She set it down and picked it back up. She did not speak. Her expression spoke. Arthur explained his proposed approach, briefly and without flourish. The sequence of the work, the stone choices, the lettering tradition he intended to draw on. He spoke the way he worked, without excess, in the manner of someone who has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to perform. Phil Duggan watched all of this from his chair. He looked at Brendan's portfolio. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the panels on the table with the expression of a man who is arriving at something he has perhaps been moving toward for a long time without fully acknowledging it. The committee deliberated for 40 minutes. They awarded the contract to Arthur Seel. Brendan was in the room when the chair read out the decision. He sat very still. He did not speak. He gathered his portfolio and stood and shook the hands extended to him and walked out, and the door closed behind him, and that was all. Phil Duggan did not watch them go. He was looking at the sample panel nearest him, turning it slightly under the fluorescent light, watching the way the cut caught and held the light along its deepest edge. He held it for a long time. He did not speak to Arthur. He simply looked, and Arthur saw in his expression something he had not expected and did not try to name. Arthur thanked the committee chair. He shook hands. He walked to the parking lot and stood beside his truck in the October air. The sky was overcast, and the temperature had dropped, and the light had the flat quality of a day, moving toward dark earlier than you expect. He had the canvas roll in the passenger seat, as he always did. He drove home. He made dinner. He sat at the bench for an hour after, not working, just working through the specifications in his mind. The scale of it, the number of names, the sequence of the work. He made a list of what he would need. He calculated the months it would require. It was large work. It was work that deserved to be done correctly. He went to bed. The project took the better part of 5 months. He worked through the winter at the bench, each name cut with the same attention as the one before it. The work was quiet and consistent and cold, and he wore his heaviest sweater and kept a small radiator running in the corner of the workshop, and he lost himself in it, the way you lose yourself in work that is large enough to require your entire self. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from work done well over a long stretch of days. It is not the tiredness of exhaustion or depletion. It is the tiredness of full use, the way a tool feels at the end of a long day, worn smooth at its working surfaces, warm from handling. Arthur had not felt that kind of tiredness in years. He felt it now, every evening when he locked the workshop door and walked back to the house. It was a tiredness he welcomed. He had looked up each name in the county records, briefly, just enough to understand the shape of a life. A man from outside Carvel, who had left a wife and 4 children. A woman who had been the first female officer from the county. A boy of 19 whose name appeared on no other public record he could find. Each name received the same attention. Each one had a life attached to it. He did not allow himself to forget that, not for a single cut. Connie came by on Tuesdays throughout the winter. She brought coffee and sat in the chair near the door, and they talked while he worked. She was reading a thick book about the Korean War. They talked about the history, and sometimes around it, about what it means to put names in stone rather than allow them to fade, about the difference between a memorial that is made and one that is simply installed. Arthur did not say most of what he thought about this. He let it inform the work instead. The plaques were installed in early March. He drove to the courthouse on the day of the dedication and stood toward the back of the small crowd. He had not been asked to speak. He stood in his coat and listened to the ceremony, and when the moment came that the names were visible in the pale winter light, he stayed where he was and simply looked. A woman near him put her hand to her mouth. She looked at the plaque with her father's name on it for a long time. She did not see Arthur standing behind her. She was not looking for anyone. She was a daughter looking at her father's name, cut correctly in stone that would outlast her and her children and her children's children, and she was feeling whatever it is that people feel in those moments, which was the thing Arthur had been in the business of providing for 43 years, and had never once stopped taking seriously. He went home. He made tea. He sat at the bench without working for a while, just sitting in the room that had become, over these past months, the most familiar place in his life. He had spent more hours in this shed than anywhere else in the past year and a half. He had changed it. It smelled of stone and oil and cold air and work, and it was, in the truest sense of the word, his. Later, after the ceremony, the county paper ran a photograph. It showed Arthur at his bench, taken by a reporter who had come to the workshop a few weeks before the installation. He was working, not posed, not looking at the camera. His hands were on the stone, and the lamp above the bench cast a circle of warm light over everything. He looked the way he always looked when he was working, entirely absorbed, entirely himself. The caption read, "The man who taught this town how to remember." He did not see the caption until Connie brought him the paper the following Tuesday. She set it on the bench next to his coffee, opened to the page, without saying anything. He picked it up and read it. He set it back down. He reached for the burin, the one with his initials in the handle, worn smooth now where his palm had rested against the wood for over 40 years. The steel shorter than it had ever been, reshaped and sharpened until it was almost a different object from the one he had first made, but the balance of it was still right. He found his place on the stone in front of him. He made the next cut. Phil Dugan drove past the workshop that afternoon. He had been going to stop. He slowed as he passed. He could see through the window above the bench, the lamp still lit, the figure at the work. He sat there for a moment with the truck idling, looking in at the light. Then he drove on. That spring, the workshop had more commissions than any previous year. Arthur took what came at the pace he could manage without cutting corners, which had always been the only pace he knew. Connie stopped in one Tuesday in April and mentioned that she had received 3 calls that week from people asking whether Arthur Seel was taking new commissions. She had told them yes and given them his number. He thanked her and wrote the names down to call in the week. She did not say anything about Seel Monument Works. He did not ask. There are things in a town that everyone knows and no one needs to say, and this had become one of them. He refilled her coffee, and she went back to her book, and he went back to the stone. The morning light was coming through the window at the low spring angle that turned the granite samples on his shelf a particular shade of warm gray. He had always liked this hour. He had always liked the early morning in a workshop before the day had built itself up into something with demands. He thought, briefly and without bitterness, about the back office on the other side of Carville where he had stood at a window with his coffee for 29 years, waiting for other people to arrive. He thought about the clock on the wall that had been his father's and whether anyone had moved it. He thought about all of it for about as long as it took to think about it, and then he set it aside. He rolled the burin between his thumb and forefinger once, feeling the weight of it, the warmth the wood had taken from his hand over so many years that the handle had become a different thing from what he had first made, shaped now to his grip, worn at the contact points, better for the use, more itself for the time that had passed. There is a name on the second plaque from the left in the Carville County Veterans Memorial, a man who had lived 2 streets over from Arthur for many years and died before Arthur ever met his family. His adult children had come to the workshop and sat in the chairs near the door and talked about their father with the careful mixture of precision and feeling that people use when they are afraid of forgetting something important, when they want to make sure the person in front of them understands that this name is more than a record. Arthur had listened to all of it. He had made notes on the back of a piece of scrap granite in pencil, as he always did. He had asked 2 or 3 questions, the kind that helped him understand not just what to cut, but what it was supposed to mean. The name is cut exactly right. It is cut in the way of someone who fully understood that every name on that stone had a life attached to it, and that the stone, if made well, carries something of that life forward into whatever time remains. He set the burin down. He stood and stretched his back and looked at the piece in front of him. The morning was fully established now, the spring light warming the concrete floor, the smell of stone dust as ordinary as it had always been. He made himself another cup of tea. He brought it back to the bench. He picked up the burin. He worked. There is a question this story raises, and it belongs to more people than Arthur. When something you have built over a lifetime is taken from you, and you are expected to be grateful for being allowed to leave quietly, there's a choice to make about what comes next. Not a loud choice, not a dramatic one. Just the choice about what you put your hands to in the morning and what you choose not to. Arthur did not announce that choice. He did not explain it to anyone. He simply made it, and he went back to work. If you have ever watched someone be quietly pushed out of the thing they built, or if you have been that person yourself, leave a comment below. Tell us what came after. If you have not yet subscribed to Old Hand's New Life, please do so now. More stories are waiting here for you.